You're listening to the Music Book Podcast with your host, Marc Masters.
Hey, thanks for checking out the Music Book Podcast. I'm Marc Masters. I've written 2 books about music, No Wave, published in 2008, and High Bias, The Distorted History of the Cassette Tape, published in 2023. On this podcast, I talk to music book authors about how they get from their first idea to a finished book, and all the decisions they make along the way. So, on this episode, I talked to Seth Neblett. He's the author of Mothership Connected, The Women of Parliament-Funkadelic, published in September of 2025 by University of Texas Press. It's a fascinating oral history of the female members of Parliament and Funkadelic, particularly those in the P-Funk sister groups Parlet and the Brides of Funkenstein, that being Mallia Franklin, Lynn Mabry, Silva, Debbie Wright, and Shirley Hayden. Neblett also includes a wealth of other voices from inside the P-Funk enterprise, showing how women contributed immensely to the group's music and legacy, while also revealing the struggles they faced with physical, mental abuse, as well as drugs, competition, jealousy, and a lot more. Seth himself has an insider's view because he's the son of Mallia Franklin, who not only was part of P-Funk and Parlet, but was responsible for the inclusion of many members of the collective. Most famously, she introduced Bootsy Collins to George Clinton and convinced him to include Bootsy in P-Funk. As Seth writes, the female members of Parliament Funkadelic, who composed the Brides of Funkenstein and Parlet, were, along with Bootsy Collins, the most successful groups to come out of the P-Funk empire. The women sang and contributed to all the organization's in-house projects. In an era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, detouring through disco and cresting on punk and new wave in the 80s, this critical female piece of the music history puzzle is as important as any other. Possibly the greatest female story of funk and rock that you've never heard, until now. Reminder, if you have any questions or comments about the podcast, email me at musicbookpodcast@gmail.com, and you can follow us on Instagram at the Music Book Podcast. Hope you're having a good start to the year, and thanks for tuning in. We got a lot of good stuff planned for this year, so I hope you enjoy it. And I really hope you enjoy my conversation with Seth Neblett. Here it is. The first thing I usually ask people is about sort of the origins of the book. Now, in the introduction, you explain a little bit of how this was originally an idea for a movie, a documentary, and the person you were working with said, we need a book first, and you tried that for a bunch of different times, and finally, I guess Bootsy Collins suggested to you, why don't you do it?
Yeah.
And and so you took it on, and then you proceeded with interviews and all the rest. But in between sort of jumping into it and deciding to do it, I'm curious what your ideas were at first, and also what kind of what you were looking forward to and what your fears might have even been deciding to take on a book like this?
Well, you are correct. It was originally a documentary
Mm-hmm.
idea for a documentary with a award-winning documentary filmmaker by the name of Paul Justman, who had just
Mm-hmm.
done at the time Standing in the Shadows of Motown about the Funk Brothers. So it
Right.
was like the Women of P-Funk was almost like a perfect follow-up to something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we had been, when the book thing kind of started, I
Mm-hmm.
started reaching out. I actually, one of the first people I was reaching out to was a author by the name of Ricky Vincent, a music historian and an author who had written a couple of books by that time. One of them just called Funk. I really wanted to get his kind of take. How should we go about this? There were different people that had kind of come into the mix. We at one time were talking to a publisher in New York, Maureen Regan, about the possibility of doing a book, and I think she had suggested some writers,
Mm.
and nobody just seemed to be the right fit. And as a matter of fact, for Maureen, myself and one of the Brides of Funkenstein, Silva, who released her own book, had done kind of like a treatment, like a couple chapter excerpts so she could get the idea. So there was a
Sure.
little bit of work that had been done. So after trying to find somebody to write this book for maybe about a year and a half, I moved from Detroit to LA. And yeah, I was having dinner with my mother and Bootsy Collins, who's my godfather,
Mm-hmm.
and griping, about, look, we're trying to get this book done. And, they're
Right.
sending us writers that wrote books on eyebrows and, stuff like that. And if you don't understand funk or the universe of funk, the complexity of it all, and the complexity of the story,
Hmm.
it could be challenging.
Sure.
So that night when Bootsy said, "Well, you just do it," there were, I don't know if it was necessarily fear,
Hmm.
but there was a little bit of hesitation as far as how am I going to do this? Am I the right person to do it? Should it be somebody from the outside doing it and not somebody that's so close to it doing it? But I said, you know what? It's got to get done. And it was kind of like, you're it. So
Right.
I kind of started from scratch. I started
Uh-huh.
conducting new interviews,
Hmm.
first with the women, the main women that were like the main participants, and
Hmm.
then kind of went in layers. It was like starting with the women, and then this next layer that were like George Clinton, Bootsy Collins, Sly Stone,
Hmm.
Ron Dunbar, who was one of the big producers with George, pretty much his right-hand man in the 70s. And, then the really important players like Gary Scheider and Bernie Worrell, Donnie Sterling. And so I started kind of like forming this universe with these different levels of interviews. And then one aspect that I thought was very, very important was also including the business people,
Sure. Yeah.
which a lot of the time you'll hear from the artist, but you
Hmm.
don't really hear from the business people. And the business people can give you a totally different perspective of what was going on. So, I interviewed Cheryl James, who was the first female road manager with P-Funk, and actually her first tasks were to manage Parlet and Brides of Funkenstein. Some of the women that ran the offices,
Hmm.
Brenda Adams, who ran the office in Hollywood, and then Leslie Volsino, who ran the office in Detroit. People like Bruce Peterson, who was a one of the marketing people, and Tom Vickers, who was the publicist for the whole Parliament Funkadelic empire.
Hmm.
And, they just really added to what was going on because now I had what I felt was kind of a complete overview. You
Hmm.
have this story of these women in Parliament Funkadelic. You have the chime-ins from the creator, the producers, the songwriters, the musicians that were in Parliament Funkadelic in the women's particular bands like Parlet and Brides of Funkenstein, like Blackbird McKnight. Then you have this other layer from the business people that really gave an eye-opening kind of account of this was George's plan. This was
Hmm.
what the workings were behind the scenes. This is what we were told to do. This is who we were told to push.
Hmm.
This is, I mean, all those things
Uh-huh.
that the artists aren't really privy to. And also, they could really lend a voice to the financial state of the group, especially at the end, how the business folded, how the IRS kind of came in and locked everything up. So I just think that all of these little planets around
Hmm.
this, big sun, which is these five women that participated, being my mother, Mallia Franklin, Debbie Wright, who was an original Parlet, Shirley Hayden,
Hmm.
who took Debbie Wright's place within probably 90 days after the first Parlet album, and Lynn Mabry and Dawn Silva, who were the original Brides of Funkenstein. It just, I think, created a picture that was even bigger than just the women of Parliament Funkadelic. It really created a picture of that universe of Parliament Funkadelic during that
Hmm.
mothership era, that
Yeah.
important time. Yeah.
For sure, yeah, and I think that's an interesting point because I think it's a really cool balance. To, like, this is about the women. Like, you center the five of them and the other women who came in. So I never got the sense that we were just like, well, this is just a Parliament history for this part of it. It was always kind of either from their POV or talking about stuff that happened to them. But at the same time, it's not they're not the only people who talk. There you get information from all the other sides of the whole enterprise. And so it's both a book about them and about Parliament, but they're the center in that
Yeah.
sense. And I think that's a good balance that you struck there. And I'm curious, as you were progressing, because you spent many years on the book, did you do a ton of interviews first before even thinking about how to structure, or did you do sometimes you go through them and put them in place and then say, I need to go talk to this person? I'm sure it was a little bit of a make it up as you go along, but I'm curious how that all happened.
Well, because I was so close to it, I knew the basic structure. I knew the skeleton
Mm,
of the book. I
hmm
felt that I knew the stories that were pivotal in the
hmm
story of Parlet and the Brides of Funkenstein. So I had a leg up kind of in that department. And it started off with the women. It started off with
hmm
their interviews, with them telling certain stories. And then I used that or used the kind of, like I said, that foundation to start going
hmm
to other people like George
Okay.
Clinton and
hmm
and Bootsy and people like that. And I had, specific questions. Can we
hmm
talk about when this event happened? Can we talk about when
hmm
this event happened? Because I kind of knew the events I was going to hit that were
Okay. Yep.
important. Of
hmm
course, as I talked to people, more events came up.
Uh-huh. Sure, sure.
And sometimes I had to go back,
hmm
and like with George, I interviewed George two or three times.
hmm
The individual women I'd interviewed over a span of years.
Sure.
There were some people where it was kind of like a one and done, but
Mm,
most of the people, especially the ones that had, I thought, real strong connection to the story, people like Ron Dunbar, people like Gary Scheider, those were
hmm
maybe two to three interviews over time. But
hmm
I knew the basic skeleton, so I kind of knew what I needed. The task was, once I had it, how am I going to frame it?
Right.
Because there were different ways. In the beginning, I think I might have started it in 1976, like when the first Mothership Connection tour happened. And,
hmm
then I kind of brought in people and things like that. But
hmm
what seemed to be the smartest thing to do was just go chronologically.
hmm
And when it came to that era of those mothership women, chronologically, Mallia was first.
Right.
So I just kind of went chronologically based on when these women kind of had first contact with Parliament Funkadelic.
Sure. Uh-huh. Yep. That
And
makes
that from
sense.
my mother being in 1967 in Detroit,
Hmm
when they were still
That's
wearing
cool.
zoot suits and, processed tape,
Uh-huh. Yeah,
you know.
that's cool. And for those who haven't read the book yet, part of how you get to her is you sort of start with your story. You start with this anecdote of the first time you went and saw her perform, and that was really cool. I'm curious, number one, how when it came to you the idea to put that early in the book, and then I'm also kind of interested. That's kind of your biggest role, and then through the rest of the book, you don't really talk about yourself a ton. I mean, there's references to you from interviews like that you were born and things like that, but really you just decided to keep your part of the story just at the beginning. And I'm curious if you've ever thought about putting yourself in any other parts of the book, or if that was something you kind of wanted to stick to from the start.
Well, well, to be honest with you, that first prelude about the
Hmm
first time I saw my mother was really the first thing I ever wrote.
Oh wow.
And I wrote that actually before I made the decision to write the book.
Oh
I
wow.
actually
That's cool.
wrote that as a
Mhm.
short story for Paul Justman when he was trying to shop the documentary
Oh nice.
because he thought that my viewpoint as a child of it he found very, very interesting.
Hmm
And so when we were first kind of talking about the documentary idea, he was still coming back and forth to Detroit a lot because he was doing a lot of things still on Standing in the Shadows of Motown. And we would
mm
just go out to dinner and I would just tell him stories from my point of
Nice.
view. And he just thought they were so amazing. And he would say, Seth, write them down, write them down. So
hmm
that prelude was the first thing I wrote. And
Wow.
I wrote that maybe two or three, at least 2 years before I actually started writing the book,
Oh wow.
making the decision to become the writer. Now,
hmm
in the original manuscript, which is probably 100 pages more
Oh
than
wow.
what's actually in the book, because of
Right.
course, the editor's like, okay, it's too much. You're gonna have to pull stuff
Sure.
out, and you're gonna have to
Sure.
condense this. And but originally, the the prelude and the ending, the epilogue, were both going to be in my voice. And the epilogue was basically my journey with my mother after those Parliament Funkadelic years, some of the
Mhm.
struggles she went through, we went through,
Mhm.
her kind of struggle to be recognized, her want to be recognized for what she had done, through her death. I mean, I had taken it pretty much from the end, well, let's say end of the 90s to her memorial service. I had
Mhm.
taken it to. And that was maybe about 10 pages.
Okay.
And I felt a little indifferent about it because it was a very, very, very personal writing.
Sure.
And the very interesting thing about it was I had gotten some advice from a therapist who just said, Seth, you should start writing things down. And by this time, I'd already was writing the book and stuff like
Oh,
that,
okay.
but just
Uh-huh.
personal things, as things are happening personally. This is right before my mother had her stroke.
Mm.
So a lot of the things that I had in the epilogue were real time feelings as I was visiting the hospital, as all of the things were going down.
Wow.
Thought it was very beautiful. I kind of asked for the women's blessing because I wasn't sure if it was appropriate or okay. And it was actually, no one had a problem with it, but it was actually Lynn Mabry from the Brides of Funkenstein who said, Seth, I mean, the truth is that this era of women started with Mallia Franklin.
Mhm.
So I think
Mhm.
it's only right for it to end with Mallia Franklin.
Mhm.
But then when it went to the book publisher and, so much had to be cut out,
Right.
I think my uneasiness,
Mhm.
of my rawness kind of was
Sure,
like,
sure.
maybe we
Uh-huh.
could take this ending out. So, but it's
Uh-huh.
still there, and who knows, maybe
Uh-huh.
there'll be an extended edition and it'll go back.
Oh yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
that would be great. That'd be great.
yeah.
That's interesting that you mentioned that you had so much more at one point in the
Mhm,
book because what I really liked about it and I thought was a little unconventional is that like a lot of the oral histories I've read, especially rock oral histories or music, funk, any kind of music, a lot of times it's almost like a documentary, like short clips from a lot of different people, kind of bang bang, and you almost feel a little bit more the hand of the person arranging them.
mhm,
Here I felt like you really gave your subjects a lot of room to
mhm,
talk. You'd have multiple instances where one of their quotes will run for a couple pages.
mhm. Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting way to do it. I think in this case, especially, it works because these are stories that haven't been told that need to be told by women who were essentially not allowed to, not given the room or space to tell these stories. But I'm curious, was that something you were kind of thinking about as you put it together? Did you ever think to yourself, maybe I need to make this more, one quote, one quote, one quote, or was it always kind of natural to let everybody have a good bit of space in the book?
For me, it was natural because my purpose, and this is one reason why I'm not scattered all through.
Hmm.
I'm really more the person that's setting up the environment, kind of setting up how this next chapter is going to read, breaking down where we are kind of in the way of what you're about to read about. But it was
Hmm.
important for me for the people to tell the story. It was important for the women specifically for them to just not be sound bites, but really to talk about their experience, their emotions behind it, their reasoning behind certain things. And, I really thought about it in a way almost like a documentary, but really
Hmm.
with, the women being the head of it, being the stars of
Hmm.
it, and giving them the
Hmm.
freedom to really express themselves. Yeah, so that I think that was always an intention from the beginning.
As we're talking a little bit about how their stories haven't been told before, and part of that was because, there were people in their way, basically like they weren't able to get the recognition they deserved often. And the reason that is kind of heavy stuff. Like there's misogyny throughout the whole group. There's not people not getting the money they deserve. There's fights within, there's abuse. And those are tough subjects but they have to be in the book because that's the subject. But I thought you did a good balance of it. It didn't feel too heavy. It didn't feel like a morose book. It just felt like reality. And
Yes.
also, I think you did a good job of always interspersing some positive things about how good they were at the music,
Mhm.
how how great the music the whole group was. And especially in the ending, when they start to break off and start to work with more contemporary artists like Prince and Ice Cube and Dr. And those people really appreciate them. It feels a little bit like, wow, this is kind of a victory, even though it's a mixed victory because they're still not necessarily getting all they deserve. But anyway, that's a long way of me asking you, how were you able to, and how conscious were you of balancing it so that the reality was in there, but it wasn't a book that just felt like too depressing through the whole thing,
Right.
I guess. Yeah.
Well, I got some good advice. One of the first people that edited my book, actually before I got a book deal, a woman by the
Hmm.
name of Susan Schrader. She had about 30 years in publishing,
Hmm.
and she was great at giving me kind of advice because this was a first for me. I had never
Hmm.
written anything.
Hmm.
And, one thing that she said to me, which rang true, is she said, if you establish that maybe, like, for example, if one of the women is having an abusive relationship with somebody, if pick out what's the most pivotal example of that, and it's been established. You don't have to continue going on and on and on and
Hmm.
read about every time this person got, beat up, or every time,
Hmm.
you don't have to continue to do that. And
Hmm.
and I really thought that that was a good piece of advice
Hmm.
because there's probably so many instances of physical abuse, emotional abuse, drug abuse
Right.
that have been left out, and that was because I didn't want to just make it a book about sorrow.
Right.
What I also didn't want is I didn't want it to become a bashing of George Clinton
Hmm.
or a bashing of, his business practices, his company's business practices, his drug
Hmm.
addiction. I didn't want to do that because it could easily turn the book into a book about George and a book about all the wrong things that George did to me. And then also, I think it was important that it wasn't all just about George's flaws, it was about the women's flaws.
Sure. Sure.
And that not
Hmm.
just George was getting high, we were all getting high.
Right. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And maybe giving some reasoning for why they stayed in the
Hmm.
situation that wasn't the greatest situation, but it was a
Hmm.
situation that they chose to be a part of. It wasn't all bad, and
Right.
there were some great things that came out of it. And I
Hmm.
think that I really was very conscious of that. There was a time, there's a period in that book that even though there was stuff going on, there was like a meteoric rise that was happening.
For sure.
There was a lot of hope and optimism and things like that. But also, I knew that kind of when you got to that pinnacle, which I always felt, and many of the participants felt, was that 1978 European tour because it was so pivotal,
Mm-hmm.
not just for Parliament Funkadelic, but for the women, that this was the first time that they were being really pushed out and, on magazine covers and all of that. And it was so pivotal.
Right.
But the tour ended so badly that by the time you get into the next couple of months, between Mallia Franklin leaving Parlet and then few months later, Lynn Mabry leaving the Brides, and all, you really start seeing the downslope, and the drugs are increasing,
Hmm.
in the organization, and the money is getting even stranger, you know,
Yeah.
and
Uh-huh.
and and then we eventually entered the era of freebasing, which changed everything,
Yeah, it's amazing how what an
because
impact.
that was something that George enjoyed. And as we know, that's
Hmm.
not a secret. He enjoyed it for a very long time. Thank God he's clean
Right.
now, but he enjoyed it
Hmm.
for decades.
Hmm. Right.
But that, I really tried to establish that the influx of drugs, I really think the ignorance of some of the management staff not really knowing how to handle that kind of beast, just really, and then not being able to pay your people correctly, which which turns into people, vital members leaving, especially with the women. Like the bands couldn't really develop identities because as soon as one version of the group is out and does a little well, somebody's gone. And
Right.
then you got to try to
Yeah.
reinvent the group. And that was something that, as you read in the book, both of the groups were revolving doors, like many Black female groups over the decades. They're very rarely all stay, all the members stay together. Usually there's replacements and there's an original version on one album and then by the next album there's a new member and an original member
Right.
left. And so Parlet and the Brides were very similar to that, but I really think what I tried to do was show more the reasoning why things were happening and why these groups didn't really become as big as they probably should have.
Right, sure. And the interesting thing, which you touched on a little bit there, is that it wasn't just that there were a lot of tensions and problems between the men kind of suppressing the women. The women had problems with each other
Oh yeah.
sometimes.
Oh
And,
yeah.
there were quite a bit of battles going on. Both the groups were almost rivals, and then internally they'd bring someone new, and that person had ambitions, and that offended the other person who didn't want, and I think it would have been kind of an easier book to write if all the women had all got along and they were all united in the but this makes them more three-dimensional people.
Yeah,
They all had individual desires, individual ambitions. Plus, when somebody above you is oppress, sort of suppressing you down, it's easy to also take aim at people beside you to
definitely.
compete for that. So it was. I guess my question is, was that a interesting thing to do, to be like, well, I've got to have them tell their stories full out, and so if sometimes the women don't look great either, that's part of the story.
Yeah, I was very intentional on not make yes, this is music history, it's Black history, but
Mhm.
also it's a book about women's studies. I always thought, because
Mhm.
one thing that I thought was one of the most interesting aspects of it is the women's relationship with the men in the group, the women's relationships with each other in the group, and the relationships with each other because of the men in the group. And all of those things play a part. I had one participant, one of the five women, when she read the final thing, the final book, she said to me that she didn't like the fact that it looked like that there was a bunch of backstabbing and catfighting and drama going on with the women. And my only response was, but there was.
Right.
I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. I'm not gonna
Mhm.
fake the funk on this. If we're gonna
Uh-huh.
do it, we need to do it
Uh-huh.
and we need to
Right.
tell it. And it's not gonna be authentic if we're gonna act like all the women just got along and their only problem was the men.
Hmm.
No, that's not how that went. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, still to this day, there's issues
Hmm.
between
I'm sure.
some of the members, the female members of the
Hmm.
group, that stem from 45 years ago. But it's I couldn't pick and choose. Even with my own mother, there were uncomfortable things in there that, of course, as a son, it's like, oh, mom.
Yeah.
But
Uh-huh.
as the author and having to keep a certain distance from the material, I had to include it. There's one
Hmm.
very interesting story that one of the women, Shirley Hayden, told about my mother in the 80s, when she was, involved in some unsavory things. And Shirley was very uncomfortable about, Seth, do we want to include that? I don't know if I feel comfortable including it. And I had to say to her, we have to include it because it was the reality of what was going on at that time. And we have to be real and it has to be raw. And even if my mother doesn't look great, I can't look at it like that's my mother. I have to look at it like this is a person that was a part of the book and this was a part of her journey.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's part of the power of choosing it as an oral history is you're letting them tell the stories. So you're not making judgments, and you're
Right.
not really saying, I know that happened this way. I know it happened that way. And everybody comes off as good and bad. Everybody's three-dimensional in the book, which I think is more important than whether it's a, a happy story or a sad story, because it's mixed. And the interesting thing is I mean, obviously you were a very good interviewer because you got great stories out of them and you got a lot of interesting stuff from them, but a lot of them are surprisingly detailed in the things that they remember, which is
Mhm.
pretty amazing. Now, of course, these were some of the biggest things that happened in their lives, so of course they would make big impressions.
Mhm.
But I'm curious if you how much you thought about, do I need to fact check any of this? There's that one really interesting section where uh, I, uh, Lynn and Dawn have
Mhm.
differing memories of this IRS situation
Mhm.
with and I love that you just put them next to each other that
Yeah.
way. And was that kind of your idea that like if there was something you weren't sure if it happened, you were just going to let them say it, and maybe you could find out from someone else or maybe not, and because I didn't get the sense that I was supposed to believe everything I heard in the book.
Right.
I just was supposed to hear it as this is the person's experience.
Yeah, I that was exactly how I chose to work with it because
Hmm.
one thing I know is the truth is always somewhere in the middle, and
Uh-huh.
that people are going to have their own memories or perceptions. They can both be sitting right next to each other and watching the same thing, but they're going to have different memories about it.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I knew that to be true. Like in that situation, I had to let both of them have their say. Dawn remembered it one way. Lynn remembered it another way. There was no doubt that something went on with the IRS. There's no doubt that there was a company that was put in their name because they do speak facts that do align. But I think the outcomes of it are very different. I couldn't, in my mind, say, okay, well, I think I might believe Dawn a little more than I believe Lynn. So I'll put Dawn's in and not include Lynn's. I wasn't there. So they were there. So if Lynn says it went one way and Dawn said it went another way, I'm going to put both of them in there, give them equal time to talk about it, and then the reader can kind of decide, I feel more towards this way or I feel more towards that way. And that happens a few times in the book. But
Hmm.
one thing that I did try to do with information, especially information that I wasn't witness to, is I would always try to involve another interview person that was there, that had seen it, that could confirm, like there's a story about Dawn Silva and Huey Newton of the Black Panthers.
Hmm.
Very interesting story. Not the greatest story as far as Huey Newton and the Black Panthers, but
Right.
it was her experience. But really, when I interviewed Sly Stone and told the story, and Sly said, yes, I had to get her out of that situation. Then
Hmm.
that was enough confirmation for me to say, okay, let's go on and run with it because we have somebody else saying, yeah, that's what happened, and this is what I had to do to get her out
Hmm.
of it. So I really tried to do that with many of the stories in the book, was try to not just have the women say, well, this is how it happened, but have them say that and then have somebody else that was a part of that situation chime in and say, yes, that's exactly how I remember it happened.
Hmm.
Another example was I remember my mother would always tell me, well, when George kind of transformed from, the zoot suits and stuff like that to the more wild psychedelic, funkadelic stuff, they were living with us. I wasn't there. It was before my time, you
Hmm.
know, but she would always say that to me. And when I spoke to Liz Bishop, who was George's fiance at the time, who was living with George, who was living with our family, she confirmed it. She said, yes, that exactly was the
Hmm.
time when all of that transformation was happening. It happened right at Mallia's parents' house.
Hmm.
So it was important for me to have kind of like that co-signer. And then there were some instances, Mark, where somebody had given me a story of an event that had happened and I'd asked the people that were supposedly witnesses to the event, and they said that never happened,
Wow.
or I
Wow.
don't remember anything like that happening.
Uh-huh.
And it didn't happen a lot, but there were a couple of stories that
Mhm.
I had to make a decision to pull out
Mhm.
because I couldn't get anybody to co-sign that it actually happened.
Interesting. Oh.
So when I didn't have anybody that could co-sign that it actually happened, I had to say, maybe we
Mhm.
need to leave this to the side.
That's interesting. And you touched on also a little bit about how you, each chapter you do a little setup, and sometimes in the middle of things you'll say things like, that album came out in May, and then this other one came out, or they were started working on. But you very much resist the temptation, and I don't know if it was a temptation for you, but I think it would have been for some people to be kind of overarching about things and be like, there were many examples of abuse, or there were many examples of, or drugs were, instead
Mhm.
you let that come out through the voices.
Yeah.
Did you ever feel, or did an editor ever ask you, did you ever have any temptation or pressure to be more? I mean, obviously, it wouldn't be to be more heavy-handed because no one would say, "Please be heavy-handed," but but it could be easy to fall into that a little bit, I would think.
Well, I can say that there were many of the chapter introductions that I did edit down
Mm-hmm.
because originally, even though they weren't things like my opinion of things, it was really more
Hmm.
like things that I would include a lot of historical stuff. Like I would
Hmm.
include certain interviews that had happened in certain magazines to show examples of what you were about to read. I thought it was very interesting, especially in reading a lot of the old articles, especially on Parlet and the Brides, how their thinking back then was different about certain things than it
Hmm.
was by the time I started interviewing them for certain things. And and so some of that kind of came out, was edited
Hmm.
out. I think it was more informational stuff. I
Right.
tried to be really thorough. I think
Hmm.
that maybe the editor, the publisher thought, oh yeah, it's just a little heavy-handed.
Hmm.
But I thought, of course, as the writer, that all of it was kind of necessary.
Sure, sure.
Uh,
Yeah, I
like
thought you struck a really good balance too. I mean, I never felt like I was being like lectured to or anything
Yes.
like that throughout the
Yeah,
book.
I didn't want to do that. I wanted it to be a
Mhm.
very welcoming story for somebody
Mhm.
who was a fan or for somebody who really didn't know anything about Parliament Funkadelic.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think it works that way great,
Thank
definitely.
you.
You mentioned early on the idea that to branch out and start talking about the business people and everything like that. That made me think of how the book is, in a lot of ways, one of the big themes is this is a book about the music industry as much as it is about the women in Parliament and how and Parliament's specific story. And it's really interesting that that whole time period when people were kind of, like would audition for groups or, and then also your mother like brought in a lot of people into Parliament Funkadelic through connections and knowing people and people vouching for each other. And I also think there's this really interesting dynamic where on the one hand, George comes off as not the fairest guy with the women and not, but at the same time, he wanted to have two female groups. I mean, how many people back then would have said, I want two female groups based on my group? Can't think of any examples of
Right.
that,
Right.
but that's another long-winded way to say, was it surprising to come to realize that you were also sort of writing a book about how the music industry worked back then, specifically for African American groups and for soul and funk and things like that?
I knew that when it came to that kind of setup, meaning the Parliament Funkadelic setup and creating these offshoots and these
Hmm.
proteges, so to speak, that George in many ways was the pioneer of a lot of that.
Hmm.
And I think that definitely in the respect of, of course, you had people that had record labels like Berry Gordy, but Parliament Funkadelic was different because, and I think this is still rings true. Later, you had people like Prince, that created the Time and created Vanity Six and all of these different
Sure.
offshoots. And then you had
Hmm.
Rick James, with the Mary Jane Girls and things like that. But
Hmm.
what was different with Parliament Funkadelic was all of the offshoots were members of Parliament Funkadelic.
Right. Uh-huh.
So not only is Parlet doing a Parlet set and then the brides are doing a bride set, Parlet and the brides are coming on the Parliament set and singing background for
Hmm.
Parliament Funkadelic.
Hmm.
They are actually group members of Parliament Funkadelic doing double duty. I don't even know if that's happened since, really,
Hmm.
with an
Hmm.
organization. Because when you look at like the Prince organization, most of his proteges, Morris Day and the Time, Vanity Six, Apollonia, they were not part of Prince and the Revolution. Prince and the
Right.
Revolution were their own entity.
Mhm.
The only one that really kind of jumped in and out was Sheila E. as a drummer.
Mhm.
But with Parliament, it was different because these women are not only singing on the Brides albums and not only singing on Parlet albums, they're singing on all the Parliament albums, they're singing on the Funkadelic albums, they're singing on some of the Bootsy stuff, they're singing on Bernie
Mhm.
Worrell's album, they're singing on the Horny Horns album. So anything that's coming out of that Parliament Funkadelic universe, these women are a part of, their voices are on.
Right.
So
Right.
that's a very different setup than I think
It
any
is.
other musical organization has ever had and
Mhm.
still doesn't have.
Yeah, and I mean, and they all seem to bring very specific talents
Mhm.
and strengths and sometimes weaknesses, but often strengths to the group. And that's again another thing that you could have like sung their praises a lot, which I think you do give them their due. But I got a feeling for what all these, especially the main five women, what they brought to both the main group and their groups, what, just through having heard of them and other people talking about them really gave me a sense of what these people could do
Yeah.
and who they were. And that's, I mean, that's not an easy thing to do without sticking your narrative voice in there. So I thought
Yeah.
that was pretty well done.
Especially when one of them is your mother. You know what I
Right.
mean? But it wasn't for me to talk about how great or talented people, I thought my
Hmm.
mother was. It was, I
Hmm.
think, more realistic and unbiased for the people that were a part of the organization to say
Hmm.
Mallia was an unbelievable vocalist. She was one of the
Hmm.
best.
Hmm.
I even found out things, that were shocking to me as far as my mother's involvement in Parlet, in talking to Ron Dunbar and interviewing with him, who he was pretty much running Parlet since its inception, and talking to Tom Vickers, who was the publicist for Parliament Funkadelic, and them both telling me almost identical stories when it came to my mother, which was George's instruction was that the focus, as far as Parlet was concerned, the focus was Mallia. And
Hmm.
whatever two girls was with Mallia were with her. But,
Hmm.
and as it's kind of explained in the book, a lot of that had to do with Neil Bogart and Casablanca Records. But also because that wasn't kind of an open fact, that was more of an open secret that caused tension with other
Sure.
women in Parlet,
Hmm.
because they didn't understand, well, why is Mallia so important?
Right.
And it had to do with Casablanca and the record deal
Hmm.
and Neil Bogart's own wishes of what he wanted to do with Mallia after her stint with Parlet was done. But,
Hmm.
of course, that's not how it was brought to the other women. It was just,
Hmm.
Mally is a part of the group. And
Right.
when all those underlying things are going on, it causes tension, it causes
Hmm.
problems, it causes tension. A lot of that, you see parts of a lot of that, I think, through the story of Parlet and the Brides.
Yeah, yeah, and it's totally understandable too. I mean, this is like every one of these people who got involved, the women especially, had some backgrounds with a lot of talent. I mean, they were kind of like this was they're getting to the big leagues. They'd been they weren't just starting in music when they when they got to the
Right,
parliament level. So they had ambitions. They wanted to be, they weren't there just to be background people.
right,
And I can totally understand why they wouldn't why they would be like I got to fight for myself in this
right.
situation, you
There was
know.
a lot of there was a lot of posturing and a
Hmm.
lot of fighting for position. And that was
Hmm.
not only just with the women, but it was also with the men too.
Sure, sure.
The
Yeah.
men in the group went through the same thing. And Gary
Hmm.
Scheider, the infamous diaper wearing frontman and guitar player, he
Uh-huh.
gave me the best, most amazing analogy of all of that.
Hmm.
And when he said to me, you know, it was all about competition.
Hmm.
And the reason we had so many keyboard players and guitar players and drummers and bass players is because you were always reminded that if you stepped out of line, there was somebody that was already there to replace you. And that made people nervous and paranoid.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I had never heard anyone explain it that way as
Hmm.
far as why there were so many members of Parliament Funkadelic. And a lot of it was rooted in competition.
Yeah, and you feel that through the book for
Yeah.
sure, for sure.
Hmm.
Another interesting thing too is that, and this is kind of what makes this book so cool that you did it. It didn't happen during while it was happening. It's later. Everybody has kind of a reflection back on it that's very clear-eyed, I think. I mean, especially the main women, they're very much like, yes, this happened. It's like it could be easy for someone to not want to tell you about like a time that they got beat up by a boyfriend or something because it's not easy to say those things to somebody, to have them be public. And they seem to all have had a perspective on it like, I understand a little bit now why all these things happened. And was that surprising to you that because almost to a person, everybody seems to have a relatively clear perspective back on these things that happened and the willingness to talk about it?
I think that comes with age and maturity. And I think that it was very important for me to convey to everyone that this story is about a moment in time. This story does not dictate your whole life. It doesn't dictate who you became as a person, who you became as a woman, who you became as a man. This is just this 6 year stint of your life. I think that looking at it that way made it more palatable for some. I mean, some of the women were just very outspoken and said, here's my
Hmm.
story, here's my testimony. And yeah, I did
Uh-huh.
that. And yeah, I did this.
Uh-huh.
And, I'm a
Yeah, that's
different
great.
person now. But yeah, these are
Mhm.
the things that I did. But interestingly enough, like I've gotten the question in some interviews specifically about some of the abusive, physically abusive relationships and mentally abusive
Mhm.
relationship, love relationships.
Mhm.
And how did I feel about the participants that were involved? Did I have did it make me feel some kind of way emotionally? And I said,
Mhm.
some of these things I witnessed as a child. I
Mhm.
said, but I'm very clear that this was a moment in time. And what may have happened between 1976 and 1982 or 83 does not define that person's journey or that person's character to me.
Mhm.
You're dealing with
Mhm.
young people. Most of them are between the ages of like 19 and 26 or 27. You're dealing with fame and touring and in the era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll,
You're right.
and sexual freedom and liberation and black exploitation and
Mhm.
misogyny and all of those things that come along with it. So all of these things are going to happen when that is the environment of the world you're living in. I mean, that is the sign of the times.
Mhm.
This story is very much the sign of the times of 70s record industry, 70s in America. How people thought about black performers, black women specifically, and how they, maneuvered through it and survived through it, and how
Mhm.
this was that generation. This was
Mhm.
this is a story of the sign of the times. What is very interesting is that some women that were involved in organizations very comparable to Parliament Funkadelic. Like I work with some of the original Mary Jane girls. I do a
Mhm.
podcast with Apollonia from Purple Rain.
Okay.
I'm friends with a lot of some of the Prince proteges, very good friends with people like Jill Jones, Susan Moonsey and Brenda from Vanity Six.
Mhm.
And what I found so very interesting is that a lot of the aspects of the Women of Parliament Funkadelic stories are mirrored in
Mhm.
their stories. I remember Apollonia reading the manuscript and getting very emotional at the end of it because she could relate. She
Mhm.
said, I can
Mhm.
relate to a lot of this just in my time in the Prince organization.
Mhm.
The Rick James girl said the same thing. I can
Wow.
totally relate to this. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
interesting how,
Yeah.
the story doesn't necessarily change. The players change and some of the,
Mhm.
definitely the instances change. But at that time, in the
Mhm.
music industry, some of those behaviors were common.
Yeah, and I think it's also very true. Like when you're a good interviewer and you get people to tell the truth and be honest, there's going to be universality in what they talk about because,
Yes,
people aren't that different. People experience a lot of the same things when they're being honest about what happened.
yes.
Um, and I'm curious, about your own experience with, so as you said at the beginning, you knew a lot of the stories, you knew the stories you wanted to tell, you were familiar, but certainly you learned a lot of stuff by talking to everybody too,
Hmm.
and a lot of stuff about things you had either seen but didn't know the whole story about, or had missed and maybe didn't get told about till now. I'm just curious, how was this as an experience for you? Because it must have changed so much of your perspective on even your own growing up in a way, I
Hmm.
imagine, and I'm just curious what kind of reflections you have on that.
It was it was eye-opening for me. It was definitely, I think it made me more appreciative of my mother's career and what she had
Mhm.
done
Mhm.
and the things that she made happen.
Mhm.
And that was one thing that I had always been told, you can't be modest about that because your mother's no longer here and she can't tell her story. So you have to be very bold in telling her story, and you have to be bold in saying, this is who she is, this is what she did, and
Mhm.
this was the result of what she did.
Mhm.
And one thing that I came away with when it came to my mother specific was that I had the knowledge and confirmation that the moves that she made, the people that she brought to George Clinton, changed the whole path of what
Mhm.
Parliament Funkadelic became.
Mhm.
And if Parliament Funkadelic hadn't become who they had become in popular music, how would that have changed future artists? Because Parliament Funkadelic was such a influence on so
Mhm.
many people like Prince and
Mhm.
hip hop and rap
Mhm.
and all of
Mhm.
those things, that if Mallia Franklin didn't have the foresight to look at Bootsy Collins and say, you're a
Yeah.
Funkadelic. You don't
Mhm.
know it yet, but I know you are. And the fact that you have Bootsy and Frank Waddy and other people saying, yeah, Mallia saw it before we ever saw it.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
she's the one that organized it.
Yeah.
She's the one that took us by the collar and took us to George's door and said, these guys need to be in your group.
Mhm.
That right there changed everything.
It really did. Yeah.
And it changed everything for George Clinton. It changed everything for Bootsy Collins. And that marriage of the two of them, along with her bringing later people like Walter Juni Morrison, who
Mhm.
produced One Nation Under a Groove and Not Just Knee Deep and Aqua Boogie, for me to really realize that my mother's telling the truth when she says that every hit record George Clinton has ever had has been either written or produced by somebody I brought to him.
Right. Yeah, that's incredible.
That's a
Yeah.
very, very strong statement, but that's a very
Mhm.
factual statement.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, for me to be able to tell the world that it was my mother that introduced Dr. Dre to Roger Troutman, which,
Mhm.
birthed California love for Tupac,
Mhm.
and have confirmation. Interestingly enough, I had done another podcast probably a few months ago, and they had done
Mhm.
a short on just my little stint talking about my mother bringing Dr. Dre and Roger Troutman together. And somehow they unearthed an old interview with Roger Troutman
Oh,
and him
wow.
saying it was a mutual friend that brought us together and said
Wow.
it confirmed everything she said.
Oh, that's great.
So to be able to have receipts
Mhm.
for the unbelievable things that Mallia Franklin specific did. Not that
Mhm.
all of the women, all of them did unbelievable things for Parliament Funkadelic, for the
Mhm.
history of girl groups, how girl groups and female, especially black female singers evolved in
Mhm.
style, in funkiness, and all of those sorts of things, and freedom, and being aggressive and all of those sorts of things. But specifically, not just as a singer, what my mother did that really changed music history and the direction of popular music has to be recognized.
I totally agree, and I think you've done a great thing with this book, and it's just so important, and you put so many years of work into it. I really admire that and really appreciate it. I mean, these things are a labor of love. Nobody's out there making tons of money off of writing books, so
You're right about that. And that was some of the advice I was getting. They were like, look, you're not going to make $1 million on the book,
right,
but you will get the story out there.
right, and that's so important.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate you putting this together, and I really appreciate you telling me all about it. And it's just been awesome to talk to you.
Thank you. Anytime, anytime.
The Music Book Podcast is produced, edited, and hosted by Marc Masters. Our theme music is by the great band Savak. Our logo was designed by Walter Carlton. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a rating and a review wherever you hear it. And thanks so much for listening.